to get us started, if you could just tell us about yourself and what you do in relation to antibiotics and what your work is.
Sure. I'm David Wallinga. I'm a physician by training. Been working around policy and with nonprofit groups for pretty much most of my career, and especially for the last 20 years, looking quite a bit actually at antibiotics, which are such a huge tool for modern medicine, but how they're impacted by being overused in American livestock production, which kind of is a style of raising animals that's gotten exported all around the world.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about why NRDC is committed to reducing antibiotic use in food animals?
Yeah, most of what keeps people healthy is are things that take place outside of our homes and outside of our offices. And a public health person like me, we think a lot about all the other factors in the environment that determine our health. And one of those is how we farm. So NRDC is focused on, and especially the team that I'm part of, the food and health team, is really focused on this intersection between how we raise food, how we raise animals, and the impacts on public health, whether they're inadvertent or as a result of kind of conscious policies.
So you kind of brought up policy. Do you think that the US is doing enough to require limited use of antibiotics in food animals?
Unfortunately, I don't think the U.S. is really doing enough to tackle this problem. Just a little background. Globally, the best estimates based on science we have is that uh, around 80% of all the antibiotics that belong to classes that are important to people, we call those medically important antibiotics. So these are things you've heard of: penicillins, tetracyclines, erythromycins. 80% of all of those sold worldwide are for use in animals, which means that only a small fraction are used in human medicine. And yet the animal use is eroding the effectiveness of these precious medicines for when we most need them, like when we get really sick or when one of our family gets really, really sick. And so the public health folks who are looking deeply at this, including myself, um, recognize that what we have to do is use fewer antibiotics, especially where they're not necessary. And unlike in human medicine, where the intent of most antibiotics is to treat sick people, in animals that's not necessarily the case. In fact, it may be that most, and maybe even a large majority of the animal antibiotics are not for treating sick animals. They're for other purposes like promoting growth or to prevent disease because of the conditions that are the animals are housed in are making them sick.
So what do you think we should be doing more of, or like as a
Well,
consumer?
that background then leads to the point that as with any fuss around the environment, um, public policy plays a huge role. I mean, I live in the Twin Cities. When I look out my window, that environment is determined through all sorts of policies and regulations. That's why, streets are what they are. That's why cars get the gas mileage that they get. And that's why in rural areas, animals are raised the way that they're raised and why antibiotics are used the way that they're used. So, if we want to have a country where antibiotics are only used when necessary and where misuse of antibiotics is curbed, we actually have to have government tracking how antibiotics are used and making sure that we conserve them so that they still work when we really need them the most. And right now, that's not happening in terms of this great majority of human antibiotics that are in fact being fed to animals.
Great. And as like, what would you recommend for consumers to do?
Well, like a lot of things, like these forever chemicals, different topic, but this is another policy issue where consumers are being told, well, just don't buy a Teflon pan or, don't buy a Gore-Tex jacket. But that's not really where the bulk of the problem is. The problem is with policy. And so consumers maybe can make themselves feel good, and they can certainly help support producers that are using antibiotics the right way, like organic producers and other kinds of producers that are pretty transparent about how they're using antibiotics. For example, ARAC has, certified responsible antibiotic use standards. So if companies were to use those standards, there would be some transparency. That's not the case for most of the meat that people buy nowadays, which is not organic and, not certified in that way. And so people are kind of in the dark about whether antibiotics are being used to make that hamburger at McDonald's or to make that chicken that they buy at, a fast food chicken place. So they should look for those labels, and they should demand of the brands or the companies that they like that they be more transparent.
Um, are there other countries that are doing a good job of limiting antibiotic use in food animals that we can look to as an example?
Yeah. So the good news is that across Europe, countries are doing a better job of tracking the problem being like the overuse of antibiotics. And they've been doing a better job than the US since 2010 or 11. And because they're tracking the problem, they're also able to respond to the problem and take actions to improve antibiotic use and avoid or reduce the misuse of these drugs, especially in livestock, in food producing animals. So, just to give you an idea, um, since Europe started this tracking and then taking action to reduce antibiotic use, livestock production as a whole across Europe has dropped by about half in terms of the levels of antibiotic use in animals. And it's gone so well that they've kind of made a new commitment to reduce it even further. So they've taken steps like they had legislation take effect earlier in 2022 that makes it no longer legal to use antibiotics on a routine basis in healthy animals. Well, the US still allows that. Europe, none of the countries in the EU are allowed any longer to do that. And that's quite important because that may be most of the use in the US livestock sector.
Awesome. So we've got a great proof of concept in the EU. Just got to mimic it somehow.
Exactly, exactly. The other thing I want to mention is that across Europe, some of the leading countries, the countries that have been working hardest and most effectively to reduce the use of antibiotics in animals, are ones that have set like ambitious targets and then met them. So I'll give you an example. In the Netherlands, they started kind of around 2012, I think, setting a series of targets to reduce antibiotic use by 20%. And then like they actually hit that much quicker than they thought. And then they upped it to 50%. And then they met that target quicker than they thought. And then they said, we're going to reduce it by 70%. And that took a little longer, but by 2011, in fact, from their baseline, they had reduced their use of antibiotics in animals by 70%. 70%. So, what does that mean to me? That means that that was not necessary use, that was avoidable use, and they've proved it. And other countries maybe haven't been as dramatic with their goal setting, but what they've found is that when you set a goal, it makes it a lot easier to reach that goal. You don't set a goal, you have nothing to really reach for. So what we're doing, my organization and partner groups, is to say the US needs a goal. It looks like we can probably reduce our antibiotic use in livestock by 50%. But we've got a ways to go to reach that. And it doesn't help that we're not even tracking the use on farms. So if you don't track, it's tough to measure any progress.
Yeah, don't even have a baseline.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was really well said. I liked the whole. We don't even have a goal. That's step one. Get a goal. That makes total sense. And that brings us to our last question. So, what is one thing that the average person can do to actually help battle superbugs?
I think right now, well, let's see. Let me just state my thought a little bit. If I was to pick one thing, there's a lot of things people could do, but at this point in time, where are we at? We've got a we've got a very divided Congress. What we do have in the Senate is a brand new chairman of the Senate Help Committee, Bernie Sanders. And Senator Sanders has kind of staked his career around changing health, getting more healthcare insurance to people. Well, the best guesses, the best expert guesses, is that this problem of antibiotic resistant, this problem of superbugs, is one of the top threats globally to our health today. And we know what's making it worse. What's making it worse is our continued overuse of antibiotics. So I think what people could do is to pick up the phone and call Chairman Sanders and say, I really care about this. My uncle or my mother or my kid needed antibiotics because they had a bad infection. And if that antibiotic that they got hadn't worked, who knows what would have happened? Maybe they'd gotten sick, or maybe they'd lose a leg. Maybe they would have died. So right now, about 2/3 of our medically important drugs in the US are being given to animals, and many, if not most of them, are to healthy animals. Again, probably because because the conditions that are making those animals sick in the first place aren't being improved as fast as they can. So we need to set targets for reducing that overuse on farms. We need to track that use on farms, and none of that's going to happen unless leaders in Congress, including in the Senate, make it a priority. Too often too often on the medical side, people talk about antibiotic stewardship, and all they really think about is whether people are, whether an individual doctor or nurse practitioner is prescribing appropriately. And for sure, that's important. But there's a larger societal issue about tracking. Like, as I said earlier, we don't know if antibiotics are being used appropriately unless we track them and unless there's reporting on it. And, that's happening more in hospitals and clinics now than it used to, but at least it's happening some. The problem on the animal side, where most of these human class antibiotics are actually used, is that there's no tracking. And there's no tracking in part because the doctors and the nurses and the rest of the public aren't demanding it. So what I would say, if you're an infectious disease doctor, or somebody working in antibiotic stewardship in a clinic or a hospital, you need to be saying, hey, I care about stewardship on farms too. And we can't do good stewardship on farms unless we're tracking use on farms. And that's not happening. So, I think we all have to think in this framework where what happens on animals affects people, what happens in people affects animals. All sick creatures potentially may need antibiotics, and so they all are vested in keeping antibiotics as effective as possible by only using them when absolutely necessary and identifying sources of misuse and overuse, which are really common, but we're not doing enough in this country to identify them and curb them.
Awesome. I think that was great.
Cool.
Uh,
Thanks, Heather.
yeah, thank you.